I have the privilege of beginning our conference on trusting God, focused on the attribute of God's sovereignty. As we dive deep into this truth today, my prayer is that what you hear today will be a comfort and an assurance to your soul. We live in very trying times. Tuesday is just another most important election of our lifetimes. I feel we hear that every 4 years, don't we? But perhaps it's because it's increasingly true every 4 years. As Floridians, we have lived for a very stressful last 2 months, haven't we? With 3 storms. First with Debbie, and then Helene, and then Milton. And in recent years, Irma and Ian. We have brothers and sisters here from Lehigh Acres and Fort Myers this morning who were directly impacted by Hurricane Ian. And this has definitely caused some anxiety for you, I'm sure. Some times of worry and of stress. And people have had devastating losses to their homes, a huge hit to their finances, and some have even lost their jobs because their jobs are not even there anymore. My son Brandon lost his job on Anna Maria Island as Hurricane Helene wiped it away. One of my pastors at my church, an elderly man, lost his home in Helene and has decided now to move in with his son in South Carolina. He's 90 years old and is not going to rebuild. And many of you, I'm sure, are still recovering from the effects of these recent storms. There's always a need to trust God, isn't there? But I think living here in this area, we maybe have felt that a little bit more during this election season and during these times of struggle with these storms. And perhaps you walk into this room with a myriad of things that are weighing you down. Maybe stress at work, stress within your families, stress with your health. We need God all the more today as we've never needed Him before. And we need to know that He is sovereign. This is a necessity for our sanctification, brothers and sisters. Knowing the sovereignty of God will help you cope and deal with the stress of everyday life. So as we begin talking about this topic of the sovereignty of God, I want to give some definitions because it's my job in this first session to lay some groundwork for what you will hear the rest of today. And this sermon will be more of an overview on the subject of God's sovereignty rather than exegeting one particular text. My brothers will deal with various aspects of that, and you see it in the program guide and how we will address that later. But let's begin by answering this question. Why does anything happen? How does anything happen? Is God only God in what I perceive to be good? Or is He also in those times where, man, that was bad? Where was God on that day? Why did the hurricanes come? Why are we here right now? Like, how did we get here? Why did that accident happen? Why didn't the doctor catch it sooner? How did I get my job? Where do I live? And how did I get there? Why do I live there? Of all the places in the world to live, why was I born now? Why am I living through these days? And people answer these questions in various ways. Some people credit the universe for things happening or not happening. It's like the universe has a way to course correct itself. That's about the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. The universe is just out to get you, I guess. Some even use the word and the concept of karma, which is actually a tenet of both Buddhism and Hinduism, which basically says you get what you deserve. That's why things happen. Live a good life, good things happen. Live a bad life, bad things happen. Really, is that the reason? Some people may be even tempted to say that these things happen by luck or by chance, meaning that what happens in our lives is just all accidental, And it can all be explained by random chance. And there's no order, there's no structure. You just got lucky you didn't get cancer. You got lucky you got the gifts that you got and the talent that you were born with, or those specific genes. You're just lucky. So it's just a random numbers, and the numbers fell in your favor. The problem with all three of these ideas is that they all deny the existence of a sovereign God. The universe is a place, not a committee making decisions about your life. Karma is a mystical force related to a false religion. Christians, please stop using that word. It's idolatrous and is based on a works-based cult. Luck or chance denies the very realities of our world. It denies that we have a creator that's designed us and our lives, and assumes that everything, like we said just now, is accidental without purpose or design. All three views are atheistic or idolatrous at best. Luck, am I just an unlucky person? Great. Karma, well, I guess I got to be better. I got to improve my life so I get the good things that are coming my way. No. So why do things happen? And when I say things, I mean everything. Everything. The good, the bad, the ugly. And the answer to that biblically is, and the one that brings us assurance to our souls, is found in the attribute of God's total sovereignty. The sovereignty of God is the absolute right of God to govern the whole of creation. In other words, God does what He wants. Why? Because He's God. That's why. The Scriptures are full with examples of a sovereign God, and we must understand life through this lens and trust Him. We're going to be looking at several Scriptures today. So if you're taking notes, I'll try to speak slow. But one of the verses that reminds us of this sovereignty is Psalm 103:19. The Lord has established His throne in the heavens, and His kingdom rules over all. No karma, no universe, no luck. It's God's kingdom, God's throne that rules. Daniel 4:35 makes it very clear as Nebuchadnezzar was facing the realities of this sovereign God, a man full of pride who thought he was all that. We see in Daniel 4:35, the Lord is described as being one who does according to His will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. Why does God do the things He does? Does He do them because we want certain things and He is no more than just a genie in a magic lamp? No, God does not operate according to our wills. He operates according to His. For God to operate in accordance with our wills makes us God and sovereign over Him. And that's not how the Scriptures define Him. Here's some theologians that have given definitions to the sovereignty of God. I think this would be helpful. A.W. Pink says, divine sovereignty means that God is God in fact, as well as in name, that He is on the throne of the universe, directing all things, working all things after the counsel of His own will. R.C. Sproul says, if there is one single molecule in this universe running around loose, totally free of God's sovereignty, then we have no guarantee that a single promise of God will ever be fulfilled. A.W. Tozer once said, God's sovereignty is the attribute by which He rules His entire creation, and to be sovereign, God must be all-knowing, all-powerful, and absolutely free. Thomas Watson says, God is the great disposer of all events and issues. He sets all the wheels in motion. He appoints the time and the manner of every providence and overrules all to his own glory. And one more. Burke Parsons says, many professing Christians don't actually believe that God is sovereign. And if we don't believe that God is sovereign, we don't actually believe that God is God. He's right. To deny the sovereignty of God is to deny the godness of God. To understand God's sovereignty today, and for the rest of this message, I want you to frame God's sovereignty underneath two subjects to see how it all plays out and how the Scriptures define them. And those two subjects are God's decree and God's providence. God's decree is the decisive act of God to ordain or determine the events of the universe. The 1689 Baptist Confession says this in chapter 3, paragraph 1. From all eternity, God decreed everything that occurs without reference to anything outside himself. This is mind-blowing to think about. That whatever happens in this world, whatever happens in our lives, the good, the bad, the ugly, the indifferent, has been decreed and ordained by God. Nothing is by accident. But why? We still haven't answered that question yet. Why do things happen? And the simple answer to that, which is quite profound, for our good and His glory. But Dan, not everything that happens to me is good. Yes, I know. Dan, there's a lot of evil in this world. Yes, I know. You see, when some people think of a sovereign God, they think of God being more in charge rather than in control. That's a big mistake. Sovereignty doesn't just mean that God is in charge, like He has to fix things as He reacts to our lives. God is not up in heaven saying, I didn't see that one coming. Because Dan did that stupid thing, now I have to do this. God is not reactive in that way. For if He were, it would deny the very attribute of His omniscience, meaning that He is all-knowing. If God has to react to my actions, that means He didn't know I was going to do what I did, which means He's not God. God's sovereignty means this: God is not a spectator, waiting to see what we will do and then reacting to it. No, sovereignty teaches us that God is the active participant in creation. We can understand it maybe through this lens. God is an author telling a story. And He's been telling this story that we call life and world history since the beginning of time. This story includes me, you, and everyone who has ever lived. God sets the plot, the climax, the ending, the characters. All of it is according to His will. All of this while still having His characters, very important to understand, we'll talk about this in a little bit, be responsible for their own actions. But through their actions, He's telling the story. But it's way more involved than that. To understand the godness of God, to understand the greatness of His glory and the depths of His sovereignty, there's, by the way, no way a one-day conference will ever begin to even do it justice. Because when you really think about this, that there is nothing in this life that happens accidental, it's just not talking about us. We're talking about every water droplet, every grain of sand, every microscopic organism, every distant star, light years away. It's all ordained by God. Everything that happens to it, everything that happens to it. In other words, no bird chirps, No grain of sand is driven by the wind to a different location. Not one wave crashes on the seashore without a sovereign God. Every atom, every strand of DNA, every microscopic organism is under His domain and acts accordingly. No person will die a second before God has ordained. And nor will they be born a second before God has ordained. God's decree is God's decision over all the events of this world. And get this, it's all been decreed long ago. God's decree and ordination of all events have been recorded long ago. Let me show you this in the Scriptures. Psalm 139, verse 16. The psalmist says, "Your eyes saw my unformed substance in your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." Every single moment of your life has been known by God. God knew you would be here. God ordained you to be here. And all the events that led up to this day, your birth, where you live, what has happened to you, has all been providential to get you to this place right here. And that is true of every day and moment of your lives. And God's decrees stand forever. And they cannot be changed. They cannot be usurped. And Job found that out very quickly. Job says in Job 42:2, "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted." Job came quickly soon, to the realization of a sovereign God. Or what God says about Himself in Isaiah 46, 9 and 10. "I am God, and there is none like me." And listen to this. "Declaring the end from the beginning." God says when it starts, and God says when it ends. "And from ancient times, things not yet done." God knew everything that would ever happen, every millisecond of this world, to every single person of this world, to every creature of this world, to every star in distant galaxies of this universe. All of them stand from ancient times. And they're not even done. Saying, "My counsel shall stand," God says, "and I will accomplish all my purpose." God is sovereign. He is sovereign. This is why to believe in luck is really an atheistic statement. And let's try to get luck out of our vocabularies. The only appropriate time to use luck is a potluck, okay? That's it. We have lots of those at our church. Why? Why is luck an atheistic statement? Because it presupposes that God did not decree that action. It just happened to you by accident. You're lucky. No design, nothing. But Dan, who falls under God's sovereign decree? Daniel 4:35, "All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and He does according to His will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay His hand or say to Him, 'What have you done?'" Not only does God get to do what He does, but He also, there is not a creature in this universe that has the right to question what God does. Nebuchadnezzar found that out. Some may say to me, "Well, God is good to me and He gives me what I want, Dan. He acts according to my will. If I do this, I get that." As my brother Josh likes to say on our podcast from time to time, keep reading. Keep reading. Again, verse after verse, we see how God acts. Ephesians 1:11. In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things. How? According to the counsel of his will. He doesn't need you. He doesn't need our permission for anything. If he did, he would not be God. This includes kings and presidents and leaders of nations. Proverbs 21:1 makes this clear. I know you know this verse. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He, speaking of God, turns it, the heart of the king, wherever he wills. You see, people who say that God is sovereign according to our wills, they have no biblical justification for that statement. Because again and again and again in the Scriptures, we see that God does not act according to what we want, but according to what he wants. How can God allow that person to be elected to office? Did you ever consider that perhaps the election of certain people over the years have been for divine judgment? But Dan, they stole the election. And perhaps that is a divine judgment on our nation as well. Isaiah 45:7. But Dan, God only is, when you say God ordains and decrees things, that's over the good things, right? Not the bad things. No, the bad things too. And that's a hard pill to swallow for many people, but if we're honest and we're going to be biblical, listen to what God says about himself. Isaiah 45:7. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. And what's the context there? Judah under judgment. It's God who's sending Nebuchadnezzar to judge Judah for their idolatry and wickedness and turning away from the Lord. It's God who forms light and darkness. It's God who creates well-being, and he creates calamity. Calamity is not under the realm, outside the realm of a sovereign God. Like, oh, well, the hurricane came and we tried our best. I guess God couldn't get to it in time. If that were true, then God wouldn't be God. Amos 3:6. Again, we see again and again the same theme. Is a trumpet blown in a city and the people are not afraid? Does disaster come to a city unless the Lord has done it? This is sobering. Perhaps even controversial. But it shouldn't be. And the reason it's so controversial is because evangelical Christianity has become weak. They have a weak God. They have a small Jesus who's only out there to cheer them on in all their greatness. But the God of the Bible is the opposite. The God of the Bible does not glorify his creation. He glorifies himself and does not owe his creation anything. God doesn't owe you or I an explanation to anything he does. He's God. And this is the lesson that Job had to learn. And he finally got it at the end. He started out good. For example, he says in Job 1:21, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked shall I return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now that's an appropriate response. Of course, in his sorrow, he became bitter, turned away from God, blamed God. Until God in the end, in Job 38 through 42, lets Job have it. And if you've never read the end of Job, please do. And so the first aspect of God's decree is his sovereignty, is his decree. It's the decisive act of God to orchestrate and ordain the events of the universe. He does what he wants. He's telling a story. The second aspect, and that happens before time began, the second aspect of God's sovereignty is God's providence. Providence is simply this: God providing for what he has decreed to happen. It's actually in the word providence, there's the word provide. That helps you make sense of that. So God says, this is what will happen. And then God's providence is seen in making sure that happens. God's sovereignty doesn't just say what will happen. He provides all the means necessary for his decree to happen. And God has never failed in that. There's never been a decree of God where God says, well, I wanted that, but I guess we couldn't get it in the end. No, God gets what he wants. He provides all the means necessary for it to happen. Remember, my counsel shall stand. I will accomplish all my purpose. Think with me through the story of Joseph. We know it well. I think the story of Joseph is a great example of providence. Before time began, obviously, because we know the end of the story, God ordained and decreed that Joseph be the one to save his family and the world at that time from famine. Joseph, one of many brothers underneath Jacob. And God uses the brothers' hatred and jealousy of Joseph to get Joseph there. Well, what they did was wrong, Dan. Yeah. But what they did was evil. They sold him as a slave and lied to their father. Yeah, and God used it for his glory. We must understand in this matter of providence that although God oversees even the sins of this world for his glory, he does not participate, or neither is he the author of anyone's sin. We don't have time to get into that, the nature of first and second causes, but all that is true. The first cause is always God, the second cause is always man. Man is responsible for every action he does, although God has ordained his actions. It's deep. Not enough to get into one sentence. But as you see the story of Joseph play out, you see it again and again. Joseph, by God's providence, is sold into slavery. He's taken as a slave to Egypt. By providence, he rises to the top of Potiphar's house and gains a great reputation. There, Potiphar's wife sins and lies about him, accusing him of rape. Is that going to throw God's plan off? Is God reacting now to something he didn't know was going to happen? No, not at all. For it was God's plan and ordination for Joseph to go to jail. What did Joseph do? Nothing. Matter of fact, as you read the story of Genesis and about Joseph, there's actually no negative things really mentioned about him. It was God's decree and sovereign plan for him to go to jail? Yeah. For something he didn't do? Yes. Why? Because God is telling a story. And he's providing all the means necessary in Joseph's life to tell the story to its completion. And it resulted for the good of Joseph and all those around him. While in jail, God gives Joseph the interpretation of dreams. He meets a butler and a baker. One of those men gets out, happens to be with Pharaoh, serving him. Pharaoh has a dream. The man remembers Joseph years later. I believe it was 2 years later, and he says, hey, I know a guy. How did that happen? Providence. How does Joseph have an audience with Pharaoh? Because he happened to be in jail with a guy who works with Pharaoh, and the two were connected. What is that but providence, providing all the means necessary to get Joseph to his end where God wants him to be? Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream, is made second in command of all of Egypt. The world is saved from famine. But in order to get there, God provided Joseph his brothers. It was God who provided him to be sold to Potiphar. It was God who provided him dreams while in jail. It was God who let him meet those men to have an audience with Pharaoh. It was God who elevated him to second in command. It was God who decreed it. It was God who provided for it. And it was God who saved the world through Joseph. And this is why Joseph, at the end, when he meets his brothers, and his brothers are scared to death. Now that he's in charge, what's he going to? He's going to kill us after what we did to him. And what does Joseph say? Genesis 50:20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. You meant evil, but God meant it. Same word. The brothers meant, God meant. God is not reacting, but He's ordaining the willful choice of the brothers to accomplish His purpose in the end. And God does not participate in their sin, nor is He the author of their sin, but He is sovereign over their sin to still accomplish His purpose. But God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. You meant it for evil, God meant it for good. Same word. Examine your life for a moment. I think as you look back through your life and you see all the different places and all the different things that have happened to you along the way, the people that you got to meet, the places that you have been, and you see the things that you're thankful for in your life now, you realize that most of those things are not possible without certain things that happened before. Let me give you just a quick example of my life. My mother was a runaway, lived in New Jersey. She ran away from home, from New Jersey to Miami, Florida. She wound up in a homeless shelter. She met a man who got her pregnant. That's my biological father. I am here because my mother ran away from home and met a man that she had never known before, slept with him. That's how I came to be. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that God all of a sudden decided to create me? No, before time began, God ordained that Dan Sardinas should live and be born, and provided all the means necessary along the way. Even my mother's running away from New Jersey, getting her to Miami to meet the one man who would compose the two people whose DNA is possible to make me. Is that luck? How is that possible? Except we have a sovereign God. My biological father and mother go back to New Jersey to tell my grandparents that she's pregnant. While they're up there, my biological father, in a drunken rage, beats up my mother to try to cause her to miscarry. He didn't want to be a father. Because God ordained that I would live and be preaching to you today, I lived. My mother was okay. He was arrested and we've never seen him again. I've never even met the man. A few weeks later, my mother reunited with her high school sweetheart, which happened to be the man I call Dad today. He's Cuban. I don't look Cuban at all. But he raised me, nurtured me, taught me to be a man. My mother became a Christian. which resulted in me becoming a Christian. How does that all happen? Well, God ordained that I be a pastor in the ministry, that I would live, but not only that, but I would have access to the gospel, that I would have a loving mother and father who would put me in ears of preaching to raise me near God. So Providence is seen in my mother running away. Providence is seen in my mother meeting a man in Miami. Providence is seen in my father raising me to be the person I am. In high school, I was going to a public school. My church at the time in New Jersey had a Christian school. I decided to go to the Christian school, not because I was really spiritual. There was a really pretty girl there. And I figure if I went to school there, I'd have a good chance of dating her. True story. It never worked out. But going to that school, I learned about my college. And going to that college, I met Lori. And we were married and have 3 children. You think about all the things along your way. God has decreed certain things about your life, and everything that happens to you is to ensure that what He has decreed about your life happens. Those are good things and bad things and terrible things. Not that God is out to get you, but that God is even using those things that tear us apart to mold us and shape us to be the people we ought to be for His glory. And sometimes that involves cancer, accidents, heartache. When you stop and think about these things, that you have no control, that's really hard for me to admit. I love to be in control. I want to know what's going on. I want to figure it out. But that does me no favors. It actually drives me crazier because things still don't go the way I want them to be. But when you realize that God is sovereign, that He is good, that He has decreed all things before time began, and is ensuring by providence that all those things are worked out in your life, you realize that He actually has your good in mind. That's when you can start to trust Him. You trust Him by learning and looking at the negative things in your life. And then when you look at those things, the things that we see are as not good, like that's not good, actually turn out to be what? Good. That's why we could look at something like cancer or an accident or sickness or all these different things. And Romans 8:28, which is overplayed by Christians and has been so watered down that the meaning has been lost. All things work out for what? Good for those who love God. Why? Because He's God. Because He's good, because He's holy, because He's righteous, because He's pure, we can trust Him. I don't like the way my life has turned out. You have a trust problem. You have a definition problem, like me. Your problem is that your definition of good is not good. And we need to redefine our definition of good by what God has decreed and allowed in my life for His glory will work out in the end for the story He's telling. And when we are in heaven, when we are looking back in the new heavens and new earth to this time, we will understand. Yeah, those were rough days. But you know what? God knew what He was doing. That God knew what He was doing when Joseph was in jail being accused of rape. God knew what He was doing. Trust Him. He's made us in His image and He loves us. Sometimes it's hard to trust God because we felt we're owed something. Remember, that's karma. You're not owed anything but grace, but wrath. You're not owed anything. Sorry, that was wrong. You're not owed anything but wrath. Any mercy or anything good you get is grace. God has not promised us an easy life, not promised us health, wealth, or riches, to be free from storms or wicked rulers who get elected. What He has promised is that He will be glorified and His story will be told. He has ordained it all, the good, the bad, the ugly. It may not turn out as nice as you'd like it to be. It may not be as comfortable as you were hoping. It might be painful, but God is sovereign over your pain. God is sovereign over your joy. God is sovereign over your salvation. God is sovereign over your stupidity. Amen. Thank you. When it's all said and done and you are with the Lord, you'll see the big picture and how the puzzle pieces fit together. Trust Him. He is good. Trust Him. He is faithful. Trust Him. He is sovereign. Trust Him, for He is God, and we are not. Let's pray. Father, help us today as we've just skimmed the surface of what it looks like to be worshiping a sovereign and holy God. Glorify Yourself through this message. Change hearts for the glory of Your name. Amen.